Hello and welcome to today's webinar on Unlocking Title I Dollars, a guide for supporting students experiencing homelessness. We are so glad that you have joined us today. I'm Erin Patterson, Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at Schoolhouse Connection, and I'm going to kick us off just by going over some logistics and housekeeping to start. Today's webinar will last 1 hour, and we are thrilled to have not only Schoolhouse Connection staff presenting, but also the Vermont Department of Education. And we ask that if you have questions for them, you please share in the Q&A box as we go through our session today, and we will get to as many of them as possible. This webinar is being recorded. It will be made available on our archived webinars page at the Schoolhouse Connection website after, along with the slides that you see today. And you'll also receive a certificate for attendance. We ask that you please allow our team about 48 hours to get those out. We have hundreds of participants signed up and joining today, and we assure you you will receive those certificates within 48 hours of the webinar. We also encourage you to continue the conversation on our SHC community Slack. You can engage with liaisons and coordinators and others across the country on questions, ideas, and best practices. On our next slide, just a little bit about Schoolhouse Connection. If you're not familiar, we are happy that you have joined us today. We are a national nonprofit advocacy organization, and our mission is overcoming homelessness through early care and education. And we work at this mission from prenatal to post-secondary, through strategic advocacy and practical assistance, federal policy, state policy. And we always say the jewel in our crown is our network of young scholars who have experienced homelessness themselves and whom we are privileged to support through scholarship assistance and wraparound case management support. On our next slide, I will preview our agenda for today. Our Schoolhouse Connection team will share an overview of the Title I Part A Homeless Set-Aside Basics and introduce you to our new toolkit. This is a practical assistance guide on using your Title I Part A set-aside, and we want to especially acknowledge and thank Christina Dukes at Pearl Strategies for her assistance in developing this resource. Then we'll lead into a discussion with the Vermont Agency of Education on how they support their local education agencies to use the set-aside effectively. And then we'll open it up to your questions and discussion. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Anna Sophia, to get us started.
Great, thank you, Erin. And I am just going to kick us off with a quick poll. Would love to know who's in the room with us, and if you know how much your LEA set aside in Title I Part A funds to support McKinney-Vento students last school year, in the school year 24-25. So I'm going to go ahead and just launch this poll. So just tell us yes or no. Okay, we're a little over halfway, so I'll give folks just a couple more seconds here. Okay, looks like most folks have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and just end the poll. And I will share that we have almost a 50-50 split. About 46% of you said that you do know what that amount was for last school year, and about 54% of you said that you did not know. So if you're in the bucket of folks who do not know what that amount is, we do encourage you to just talk to your federal programs director or your Title I-A coordinator just to determine what that amount actually is, because it can be really, really helpful in determining what that amount should be moving forward. Often we see McKinney-Vento liaisons and LEAs use kind of what has been used historically and figure out how to adjust it when they're making those budget decisions. So really good opportunity to talk to folks in your LEA already. So I'm going to go ahead and keep us moving. I'm going to kick us off with just a quick overview of all things related to the Title I Part A set aside. So the first thing to highlight is just that Title I is part of the Every Student Succeeds Act. It is a federal funding program really designed to close achievement gaps and make sure that all children have a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain high quality education. Part A is the largest part of the program and allocates funding to districts and other local educational agencies based on a formula that is on the number of children from low income families. LEAs distribute that funding directly to individual public schools, and really it's on those LEAs to make decisions about how they're spending those funds. What is really, really important to note is that we know that there are several funding sources to support students experiencing homelessness. Typically, the one that we talk about the most is EHCY funds, those McKinney-Vento subgrant funds, but those are just a small pot of money. And we know that more LEAs receive Title I Part A funds. And so that is why we have been on a mission at Schoolhouse here this year and definitely into next year, reminding folks that these funds are available for you and that they must be set aside for students experiencing homelessness. And I kind of mentioned this already, but want to highlight again that LEAs are required to set aside these funds to support their students experiencing homelessness. Students who are homeless are categorically eligible for Title I Part A funds, regardless of which school they attend. And again, I already shared this earlier, but we'll highlight it again. 76% of LEAs do not receive those subgrant EHCY funds, and they really must rely on Title I Part A funds to meet the needs of students experiencing homelessness. We also know, based on an independent study that came out of the American Rescue Plan Act, that when there is dedicated funding to our students experiencing homelessness, we see improvements in identification, attendance, and just overall school success. And so really being able to fund these supports can make a huge, huge difference in the support that you're giving your students. The other thing that we typically get a ton of questions about is exactly how Title I Part A funds can be used to support students experiencing homelessness. And so there are a couple of guiding principles that you want to think about when you're thinking about using this funding source. So first, you want to make sure that any services are reasonable and necessary to enable homeless children to take advantage of educational opportunities. And you want to make sure that these funds are being used as a last resort when services are not available from other sources. Some specific allowable uses are defraying the cost of transportation, defraying the cost of salary, and more, the salary of the liaison and more. The other thing, again, I'll just share an example of something that we get questions about. So for example, if you are an LEA who typically works with a community partner to cover the cost of school supplies at the beginning of the school year, you wouldn't use your Title I Part A set-aside funds to fund that particular activity because you already have a community partner and a funding source that's doing that for you. But if you're not in that situation, then you could use them. So again, thinking about what is available to you is a really good first step in determining how to spend those dollars. A couple of additional Title I Part A funds allowable uses. I won't go into all of them, but these are a couple that are that I wanted to highlight, which is specifically that you can use them for things like food, medical and dental services. You can use them to provide extended learning time or hire tutors and provide on-site tutoring services. And so again, typically we see that a lot of LEAs are reserving funds for school supplies or things that are tangible to help students meet their basic needs. And that is absolutely allowable, but you can also do so much more with these funds. And so encourage you to just take a look at these allowable uses and consider how you might be able to make those dollars work for you and your LEA. And as Erin alluded to earlier, we at Schoolhouse Connection have been working on a ton of resources around Title I Part A set-aside homeless funds, and particularly we published this resource earlier this year. So this is an actionable guide really for practitioners, for leaders, for advocates, anyone who really has any input around how to spend this funding source. And so the guide is made up of several sections, and one of them is a Q&A section. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of questions that we typically get. One of them being how much funds should actually be reserved to support homeless students. And so I want to just remind everyone that the federal law does not set a specific percentage or dollar amount, but it is important to note that whatever funding is being reserved is the amount that is necessary to provide comparable services to homeless children and youth to help them meet their unique needs. So again, this could look very different depending on the size of your LEA, depending on the number of students that you have identified. And so it's really important to just think about what makes sense for you and your LEA. Another question that we typically get is around adjusting that set aside amount. We know that for many LEAs, sometimes you start with a number of identified students in September, and that number can look very, very different when you're looking at your numbers in the spring, maybe in May. And so all that to say that you are allowed to adjust those reservations depending on specific circumstances. So if you happen to see an increase in homelessness, or there's a natural disaster or some other economic hardship that is causing a rise in homelessness, you are able to adjust those set aside amounts. So again, this is a really great time to reflect on what you're seeing or what you saw this fall and how that might look in the spring, and think about how you might be able to adjust those reservations for this school year. The other piece that I will highlight here is that one of the things that we're really proud about in this guide is that we were able to sit down with LEA liaisons and talk a little bit about what they were doing to support their students experiencing homelessness. So we have a couple of spotlights of LEAs across the country who are doing some really phenomenal things with their funding sources. Unfortunately, we had a change in plans today, and so we won't have an LEA to speak with us as one of our panelists. But we do have our folks from the Vermont Department Agency, Educational Agency. And so they will be here with us today, but we don't have an LEA panelist. But the good news is that you can look up these spotlights in our toolkit. And so I encourage you to do that. And we are going to talk a little bit later about what's coming in the new year and when we'll talk to more LEAs. And then section 3, again, really focuses on the critical role of states in helping guide these decisions. And again, we do have representatives today that will give us a state perspective on how they're supporting their LEAs. So encourage you all to just take a look at those sections as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Karen, and our folks at the Vermont Agency of Education.
Thank you so much, Anna Sophia. Before we jump in and hear from our colleagues, I want to just address a couple of questions that have come in just to kind of help provide a little bit of clarification before we move into this next piece of our webinar today. The first question that we got was, just in the world of education, we know that there are a lot of acronyms and there are a lot of specific educational terms that we use. So a question came in the chat about what is an LEA. And so just to define that for you, an LEA is a local education agency. So that refers to school districts and other entities that serve in that role. So in some places that may be a regional office that's considered an LEA. School districts are considered an LEA. And so there are different kinds of educational entities that make that up, but that is the term LEA, Local Education Agency. Another question that came in the chat is, how do Title I Part A funds get to schools and kind of the route that takes? So the federal government gives those funds to states, and then the money is distributed from states to LEAs and to school districts. So that is kind of the path that takes. That was the specific question of does it go right to LEAs or does it go through states first? So I just wanted to address that question as well. And then there was one more question in the Q&A box, just thinking about kind of some of the allowable uses and what that really looks like. And so I just want to, again, echo what Anna Sophia said and thinking about how can we use these funds creatively and outside the box. So the question specifically was, how does something like outreach have a cost? And so things like that may include staff time to do some of that. It may include materials. It may include making videos or, special posters or QR codes or audio files, and the time that is spent in doing some of that. So it could be staff time, it could be materials. There are a lot of different things that can include. So again, we're thinking creatively and thinking outside the box of kind of what do these different pieces look like of how we can use these funds. So just wanted to take a minute and answer a couple of those questions that came in. We will have time after this next section to answer some more questions, so please keep those coming. And please, as you're hearing from our panelists from the Vermont Agency of Education, drop some questions for them in the Q&A box as well. So That's the best place. The chat has been hopping and we don't want to lose your questions in the chat. So please put those in the Q&A box if you don't mind. And with that, I am very excited to transition into a discussion with the Vermont Agency of Education. We have today with us Katie Preston and Jesse Murray, and I am going to turn it over to them to walk us through what is happening in Vermont and what Title I set-aside funds look like in their state.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. We have a couple slides to share with you all. So Karen, if you can just give me a thumbs up if you see that, maybe? Not yet. How about now? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate the thumbs up. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Preston. I am the state coordinator for McKinney-Vento in Vermont, joined by Jessie. I'll let her just hop on real quick and introduce herself before I jump in.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Katie. I'm Jessie Murray. I'm the Title I director in the state of Vermont, and I work very closely with Katie every day.
Okay, so I'm going to start just by giving folks a quick kind of overview of what our system in Vermont looks like, and then a little bit about what our McKinney-Vento program looks like. So we have 52 LEAs, local educational agencies. We refer to them as supervisory unions or districts in Vermont. We have 52 of them. We have about 80,000 students enrolled in public schools in the entire state. And we identified 1,919 students experiencing homelessness in the 23-24 school year. So looking a little bit deeper at that number and sort of our trends and identification here, you can see that we have been increasing pretty consistently over the last couple of years in identified students who are experiencing homelessness, particularly in the years that have been following COVID. So historically, we averaged around 1.5% of all students who were identified as experiencing homelessness, but that has been increasing. And in the 23-24 school year, we were just over 2% of all of our students as being identified as McKinney-Vento eligible. So looking sort of like pre-COVID to post-COVID, so that 19-20 school year to 23-24, we've had an overall increase of 117% in identified McKinney-Vento eligible students, with an sort of average percent increase each year of about 15%. And then just looking in the last 3 years, that increase each year has jumped up to about 25%. So we're definitely seeing increases in numbers. I think for a variety of reasons. COVID certainly had an impact. We have a real affordable housing crisis in our state. Our identification efforts have really increased and improved. So we are definitely seeing, continued numbers there. Just in terms of the subgroups, so we report on the number of students who are experiencing homelessness who are also students with disabilities, who are unaccompanied youth, English learners, and migratory students. We tend to be fairly stable year to year. We consistently identify a higher percentage of students with disabilities who are homeless, about almost 30%, than the national percentage, which is closer to 20%. And lower percentages of English learners. So the national percentage for English learners identified as McKinney-Vento eligible is about 18%. In Vermont, we typically identify about 3%. And then just thinking about the housing situations or when students are identified, about 55% of our students who are experiencing homelessness are in doubled up situations. 30% are in hotels or motels, about 9% in shelters, and 6% are unsheltered. And that is generally fairly consistent. The numbers of students in hotels or motels has also been quite consistent and higher than the national percentage since COVID, as we continue to operate an emergency housing program through hotels in Vermont. And then the last thing that I kind of wanted to mention, just because Anna Sophia mentioned the McKinney-Vento grant, fewer than 20% of our LEAs receive that dedicated McKinney-Vento grant funding each year. We receive the small state minimum, which is usually we have about $275,000 available to subgrants. So it's just a very, very small amount of money. So our LEAs really do rely quite heavily on the Title I-A set aside to meet the needs of students who are experiencing homelessness. Okay, Jesse, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Katie. So we were asked to think about how we coordinate at the state level to support the homeless set aside and support our LEAs in utilizing the homeless set aside. And so we, I think, have been really intentional over the past few years to make sure that we've provided some coordinated trainings, particularly between our grants team and, again, Katie speaking as the McKinney-Vento state coordinator. We've developed some new guidance and are working really closely when we respond to questions from districts directly about the homeless set aside and allowable uses of it and how to best meet their needs. So we've been really intentional about really trying to coordinate together in our responses to make sure that we're supporting our LEAs. In terms of sort of like the nuts and bolts, our application itself does require LEAs to reserve funds for the Title I homeless set aside in the application directly. So they actually can't submit the application if they don't reserve at least the minimum. For our state, we have set that minimum at $500. But we see the majority of our LEAs actually are reserving far more than $500. And you can see it ranges between 500 all the way up to 100,000, just depending on the needs of that particular LEA, what they're planning to use those funds for, and how they're planning to support their students. So it is very sort of wide ranging and varied depending on this particular situation of the LEA. And again, we think that that's important because it is intended to respond specifically to the needs of that local education agency or the school district. We also use a document which we call the data inventory. And this is where LEAs are sort of summarizing their comprehensive needs assessment, including information specifically about students experiencing homelessness, the numbers of the students in their district, trends, academic information, et cetera, so that we can sort of help them start to think about what those needs might be and what they might want to then use their funds, their Title I homeless set aside funds for. So, that application requiring that set aside directly in the application before submission is sort of that sort of technical piece that requires that. And then on the review side, as the Title I director, I'm reviewing the grant application with the supporting documentation to make sure that there is that alignment between the actual dollar amount that they've reserved to make sure that that seems sufficient and reasonable to support the needs that they've identified. And then also for those actual activities that they've invested in to make sure that they, again, appear reasonable, that they're necessary to actually respond to the identified needs and those sorts of things. And of course, that they're also allowable under Title I. So I'm doing that review of the application. Again, getting back into when there's that collaboration, though, at that state level, between me and Katie, our McKinney-Vento liaison or state coordinator. If there's ever questions of reasonableness or allowability or of something that maybe there's some sort of context of something that's happening at a particular region of the state, that's when I will connect with Katie to get their perspective. If I'm reading something in a data inventory that doesn't seem like there's enough information for me to really grasp a full understanding of the context of a LEA, or if I don't know that, maybe they're describing really significant needs and a large increase in students that have been identified as experiencing homelessness, but then their set aside is really minimal, or they haven't invested in a wide variety of activities that actually are addressing the identified needs that are in their data inventory. That's, again, when I'll connect with Katie to say, what do you think about this? Does this align with your understanding? And what sort of feedback can we give? So we do collaborate to provide suggestions about that kind of that feedback to the LEAs. And then also if LEAs are struggling to sort of consider what their needs are, we might prompt them with thinking about the different types of data that might help them identify those needs. Usually there's a lot of needs, right? We all know that. So we're usually trying to help them kind of identify what data is specifically going to help them identify that particular needs that they can then address with a specific activity or an investment. And so we kind of help guide them a little bit through our technical assistance in that way. We have some LEAs that really are look at what they've done historically, and they year after year do the same things. And we have been working to try to prompt them to consider, to actually, again, every year look at their data and see, are there trends that are different? And just because you've always funded something in one way year after year doesn't mean that that's the only way that you can use these funds. And so we're hoping that they will consider all the data that they're looking at to identify the true areas of need to support those students. Katie, do you want to jump to the next slide? Thanks. So this is a sample. It's kind of small, so bear with us for that. But this is just an example of one of our LEAs that has submitted some information on a data inventory. So you can see here kind of the prompting fields or questions that we've given to them and what we ask for them to provide to us. So we have this information when we're reviewing their grant application to see if something is reasonable and necessary, if it's aligning with what they've budgeted in the grant. So we do ask for them to identify their intended or planned for set aside. We ask for them to actually give us the number of students. We do know, of course, that changes throughout the year. So this is sometimes like a point in time, but it gives us sort of that understanding that they're thinking about these things and that we're prompting them to think about these things at the beginning of the grant cycle so that they're planning for what they're doing. And it also helps them, I think, actually sort of take a pause to see, is this maybe reasonable? For I'm writing all these needs here. I'm writing all the different data that is, particularly about this group of students. And, maybe I've only identified that we're going to reserve $1,000, but after writing all these needs and all this, summarizing all this data, that might not feel sufficient anymore, right? Similarly with that per pupil amount. So that's a new revision that we've added just last year because again, we were seeing huge variety or, huge range from differing LEAs, and having them actually do that calculation, I think helps them just think about it in a different way of like, does this actually seem reasonable to do any sort of, meet any sort of need for a particular student. So while we know that not every single individual student is going to necessarily receive that amount of dollars of services, I think it just is like another data point, another measure to use to help determine that reasonableness there. So you can see again also the sort of questions that we use to prompt them to consider about what kind of data they should be thinking about, the variety of different needs that they might be attempting to address here. So that's just sort of a sample of our data inventory that we thought might be helpful to see.
You ready?
Yeah, thanks. And okay, so we had talked a little bit about how we've made a pretty concerted effort over the past few years to provide some guidance and training, make sure that our LEAs, our school districts really are aware of the requirements of the Title I set aside, and then also of the allowable uses of that set aside. So we've done a lot of work to make sure that our LEAs really understand that and are thinking about it, and then also are tracking those funds. So, what we do see sometimes is that they set aside those dollars in the beginning of the year because they're required to, and the application forces them to, and then they might forget about it. They clearly have all these needs that our students are experiencing throughout the year. But if they're not actively thinking about it throughout the year and then sort of reassessing how they're addressing those students' needs with these funds, we have seen in certain instances where that might sort of get forgotten about, right? And so we're really trying to make sure that they understand the importance of like tracking those funds, being aware of them, and being strategic about how they're going to then invest those funds. This table here shows the difference between over the past few years, the initial set aside that LEAs have reserved at the beginning of the application cycle, and then the darker green color bar is actually the final set aside that LEAs have in their application at the end of the grant cycle. So you can see that pretty consistently year after year. LEAs start with $1 amount. Oh, this is at the state level, so it's sort of summed up to the state level. But generally speaking, we do see that what is reserved in the initial application, it does increase by the time that we get to that final application. We have a pretty fairly open amendment process with our consolidated application, which is where the Title I grant is. It's in a consolidated application with a few other title grants. So that means that LEAs can amend as many times as they want throughout the year. And we think that, we frequently see LEAs are adjusting that homeless set aside, adjusting their investments, increasing their budgets, or adding different budget lines. So maybe they originally only thought that they were going to put it all towards transportation. And then throughout the year, they realize that they have this additional area of need in, maybe contracting tutoring or a counselor or something like that. And so they might add in another budget line during an amendment. So we definitely see that throughout the year. Those amounts change. And I think that's just important to recognize because, for us, we think that is reflective of the LEAs responding to the current needs and also recognizing that what they put in the original application might not be sufficient for the entire year. So that's what that data is showing there. All right. So similarly for what we talked about a little bit when I was referring to the data inventory, we have started to ask those LEAs to kind of think about what their per pupil set aside would be. Again, we as a state don't have a minimum for a per pupil amount. There's no target amount. We just think it's helpful context for them to be thinking about and for them to be aware of. So this data this chart is showing the state total. So the total state set aside, sort of summed up for the state, and then the total number of identified students. You can see that there was a little dip during the COVID years when we had COVID funding, I should say. And that I think just sort of aligns with the fact that there was additional funding sources to support the needs of these students. But over the years, even as we have seen, Katie talked a little bit about our housing crisis in the state, and there were some natural disasters, some floods over the past few years, which really impacted housing across the state. And so, we have seen, again, a pretty consistent, per pupil amount held for our students, which I think just demonstrates that there's definitely needs there. And even as the number of students that are identified are increasing, the set aside is also increasing. So that per pupil is definitely pretty consistent year after year. Oh, there we go. Okay, so some comment. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks. my tab got mixed up. So for our common uses of funds, we definitely see. I think one of the common things we see are LEAs sort of looking historically at what they've done with their set aside, and it's almost like a habit to just fund the same thing year after year, right? And so we have really tried to get LEAs to consider all the various needs of their students during that needs assessment, that comprehensive needs assessment. We have made some intentional revisions to the data inventory to prompt LEAs to consider the variety of different challenges or needs that those students might have. And then are really trying to encourage them to think beyond just that one, budget line they might have always done. We definitely see a lot of funds that from that set aside that are going towards the cost of excess transportation. In Vermont, we have a fairly rural state, and there's not a lot of public transportation or that sort of thing. And so in a rural district, if they have a transportation need, they might have to be like hiring an individual driver to drive a student, across the mountain range. And so those expenses can get really quite high very quickly. So that's a really common one for us. But again, we are trying to make sure that LEAs understand that that's not the only use of these funds and that they can really be utilizing the funds in a variety of different ways. So we encourage them to include all of those budget lines, whatever they think might come up throughout the year, to include at least a budget line for some allocation of that set aside to a variety of different needs, so that if it does come up during the year, it's already in their grant application and they can utilize it immediately. So yeah, things like additional types of contracted services. I know we talked about this earlier on in the beginning of the presentation, but just to kind of reiterate, tutoring or counseling types of services, staffing, so providing actual, portion of a contracted position, or what we see often is stipends for additional work beyond a contract hour for additional staff. We also have seen these funds be used for things like training staff to improve identification practices, right? So there's not just like one person at the district that's responsible for this entire population, but so that more staff can be aware of, what to look out for and how to support these students. So, and then of course, things like supplies, educational supplies, even supplies just that would allow students to participate in their education, come to school, in Vermont, that might be snow pants, things like sneakers to participate in gym. We also have seen an increase, I would say, as well. It's not listed here, but like in funds for student fees. So for students to participate in the field trip or the extracurricular program, things like that. Those are a little bit more, I think they're not as common, or people maybe didn't realize that they could be utilizing those funds in that way. But we are seeing, I think, an increase in that, which is, again, the intention of this set aside is to support the students in actually accessing their education and being able to have an equitable opportunity. So if that student fee is what's going to do that in that scenario, then that's a great way to utilize those funds. Katie, you can switch to the next slide.
Thanks,
There you
Jessie.
go.
Awesome. Okay, so thinking a little bit about how we Jessie talked a lot about how we try to support LEAs in this, but we have some really kind of concrete guidance that's gone out. We've really tried to increase our trainings, our guidance, our technical assistance in this area over the last couple of years. There were some monitoring findings in other states from the U.S. Department of Education around guidance or lack of guidance from states to LEAs around how to use the Title I set aside. So it was in 2024, early last year, we put out some guidance really specific to this, talks about how to determine the set aside amount, talks about the need to use local data in determining the amount and the proposed activities, lists, some of those allowable uses. And then it also really highlights the importance of coordination between the liaison and the Title I grants manager, and describes basically what Jessie just described, how that coordination is also reflected in our application reviews at the state. We talked a lot about the coordination of our application review, but really, I'm not sure if we mentioned this at the beginning, actually, or maybe you did, Jessie. Jessie and I are on the same team. And so, by virtue of being on the same team, we are designing and delivering a lot of joint trainings. We're doing a lot of crossover trainings. Jessie comes to our annual training for liaisons. I am at all of the title consolidated application trainings where we're meeting with business managers and grant staff. So we're really just, it's kind of built into our trainings to talk about allowable uses and the required set aside amount and that coordination with liaisons, grant staff, and business offices. We are really excited about the quarterly spending reports. We've been doing that for about a year and a half. I think it's been a full grant cycle. Where we send out quarterly spending reports that cover all of the title funds, and they let districts know throughout the year how much of their title funds they've drawn down and what's remaining, and what's, potentially available for carry forward. just really trying to support them in tracking spending, the need for possible amendments. So again, just kind of supporting that that tracking there as well. And then lastly, we include the set aside amount in our monitoring. So we monitor, because we're a consolidated application, we monitor all the title programs together. But we also include the McKinney-Vento program in that consolidated monitoring. So when we monitor, we are talking with both the grants team and the liaison at that LEA about the set aside, how much they set aside, how did they determine it, how much is spent to date, what activities are they doing, are they successful, is there a need for an amendment, and sort of that overall process for making that determination. So really try to have kind of a full cycle, like from the beginning of the application all the way through the grant cycle and into monitoring. We're kind of touching that Title I set aside at every point. And then I would also say, it's not on the slide, but new this year, we are going to have the ability to track the budget line item by set aside after grant closeout. So we will be able, hopefully, to see really to see those line items, to really drill into how much is being spent of the Title I set aside on transportation specifically, how much is being spent on tutoring and things like that. So we don't have that ability quite yet, but we're really close. And so that's really exciting. So that's what we had for you all.
Katie and Jesse, thank you so much. I want to just say that we've had a lot of questions coming in the chat and in the Q&A box, asking if you'd be willing to share your slides and also your data tool. People would love to take a look at that if there's anything from that you can share.
The data inventory?
Yes, thank you, yes.
Yeah, I think we could probably share a blank copy of that. We can definitely share the slides. We'll send those to you, Karen.
Yeah.
And then we can make sure, I'm sorry, Jesse, go ahead.
I was going to say our data inventory tool is on our website right now, so we can definitely share that.
We will put the slides together and the data inventory tool and make sure that we are sharing that out and that it's posted along with the slides from Schoolhouse Connection and the recording on our website. So you'll have access to all of that after our time together. I just was looking back through the questions here that we have, and there are so many questions about allowable uses. So I think that maybe we will take a few minutes to jump into some of these questions. And Katie and Jesse, if you have thoughts, feel free to jump in and answer these as well. But some of these are some general questions. One in particular I want to address about carrying over set-aside amounts that came in both in the Q&A box and in the chat. So that is definitely a hot topic right now. And I know that in most places, 15% is that carryover limit. But I want to say that I think if you're looking at carrying over funds, I would really encourage you to think about what are the needs of your students that you're not spending your funds on. And so if you're looking at, okay, we have X amount of dollars to carry over, and you're thinking about kind of how to go about that carryover process, I would really encourage you to go back to your business offices or your federal programs directors and really take a look at what those needs are. When Katie and Jesse were sharing about kind of listing out those needs in that data inventory, I really think that if we're going back and we're doing that consistently and we're looking at those needs and looking at the trends over time, we might not have the same needs in the fall that we have in the spring. And so really looking at what those needs are and intentionally going back and reviewing that to think about how those funds are spent, that might help to take care of some of that challenge of having a carryover, to really be intentional about that. So Katie and Jesse, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that as well, if there's anything you want to add.
I would just absolutely agree. And I think that's why it's really important for you to make a connection with whoever's managing the grants at your district, because Katie and I both touched a little bit on how we've been working with our districts to understand the importance of being aware that there is a set aside and how much that is, but then also of that tracking throughout the year, right? Katie talked a little bit about our spending reports. Yes, carryover is a thing, and you could carry over dollars, and some LEAs do for various different reasons. But I think it's important if you're in the middle of a year, it's important to think about that now so that you can readjust and amend your application or address the current needs instead of just like planning for what you're going to do next year, because you have the opportunity to address it now as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. There were also a number of questions about using Title I Part A set aside funds for salaries. And I know Katie and Jesse talked about that a little bit. But I also want to encourage you to think about what are those possibilities for looking at using your set aside funds and kind of braiding and blending those with other funding sources, and really thinking about kind of sustainability and the work that you're doing. And so I'm excited to just kind of preview. I'll very briefly say in 2026, we are going to do a short series of webinars with some local liaisons talking about how they're using funds. And there's a lot of really creative things happening when it comes to looking at that blending and braiding funds and creating positions to support the work of the liaison and thinking about how that looks with school counseling staff and how that looks with supporting and serving other highly mobile populations. So I want to really encourage you to kind of think about that. And I will say that as the liaison, that might not be in your realm of kind of knowing what that looks like. When I was a liaison, I was not a part of those conversations. I didn't know what funding sources were available to me from other places. And so I cannot emphasize enough that that is why it is important to have those connections with your business office, with your federal programs directors. Reach out to the other folks that work on those title programs and really sit down and talk about the needs of your students and what that looks like. Bring everyone to the table and have a seat at that table as an advocate for your students experiencing homelessness. So I'm just kind of thinking about as we're looking at funds, we know that Title I funds are an excellent option for that, and they also won't cover everything that we need for all of our students and all of our capacity. So really kind of thinking creatively about that. So I'm really excited for the liaisons that you'll hear from in 2026 when we go through that and they talk and share some of those strategies. So I just wanted to put in a short plug for that. There were also a number of questions about transportation. So I want to just say we know that funds can be used for transportation. Again, Katie and Jesse talked about that, especially in areas where there is not public transportation or there may not be cabs or other transportation services. I will share just to brag on Vermont a little bit. I spoke with a liaison last week from Vermont who shared that they hired a driver with their Title I Part A set aside funds because they had a student that they were transporting, and that was the best way to get that student to school. And they have been able to really keep that attendance and participation and engagement consistent for that student because they were able to use those funds for a driver. So transportation is definitely allowable. And again, I just want to say, thinking outside the box, you'll hear me say that probably a million times about what that looks like, but really meeting the needs of your students and really thinking about how you can use those funds. I will also encourage you to think about not using all of your funds for transportation. That is important, and we can't provide services and supports to our students if they're not in school. But maybe that funds part of your transportation costs, and then you can do things like tutoring or academic supports or other options above and beyond that. So again, kind of thinking outside the box of how you could piece some of those different things together to best support students. All right, let me go back to the Q&A box. And Anna Sophia, are there any questions coming up that I have not gotten to yet here?
So that's kind of the normal.
Sorry, my headphones aren't working. I did just want to say that there was a couple of questions specifically about how to calculate per pupil allocations and kind of any best practices there. And so, Karen, I know you have some thoughts. I know some folks in Vermont might have some thoughts about how their LEAs are doing it. So I wanted to just open that up for discussion as well.
We can talk a little bit about, I think Jesse touched on that a little bit. We don't have a required per pupil amount in Vermont. We have a required overall set aside, and then we're really using, again, specific to Vermont, we're really using that data inventory tool to understand how the LEA came up with that total amount, the really encouraging them to look very broadly. When the slides go out, you'll be able to see that data inventory example, but we try to really have them think broadly about those needs. It's not just, are we providing transportation, but it is kind of the full picture of education and educational success. So in terms of calculating that per pupil amount, that we're just asking them to take the total amount that they've set aside and divide it by the number of students that they've identified, and then with the hope and intention that, if they do that and see like, gosh, we set aside 5 cents per pupil, that's going to be kind of that flag for them. That's like, that's probably not sufficient realistically. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add, Jesse.
No, we have like a few, again, prompting questions that we give them to like help them start thinking about some of these things. What have you spent in the past? Was it sufficient? Did you only narrow your focus on one particular need, or did you think broadly about all the needs? Have you seen increases or decreases in your numbers, right? So like we try to prompt them to think about all of these things so that they do that broad sort of consideration, like Katie said, but we don't have like a specific formula for them to calculate.
And there may be other states that do have specific formulas that they offer. I know there are other states that will give you, you can kind of pick and choose how you determine that set aside amount. It might be a per pupil, it might be a percentage, it might be another amount with an explanation of why that's reasonable and necessary. So if you are unsure, again, connect with that federal program staff in your LEA. You can also work with your state coordinator and or your state Title I staff is also a great resource for that as well. And there was a question that I saw in the chat about whether these funds are available every year. So I just want to address that one. And the question is kind of a two-part about EHCY subgrants and then the Title I set aside. So yes, Title I set aside funds are a yearly funding source. Again, there's factors that determine what that allocation is. So it may not be the same amount every year, but that money comes from the federal government, again, to states and then out to LEAs. And so if you, again, are not, part of those conversations, the very best place to start and our very best recommendation to you is to find out who is and to connect with that person. We will say that over and over again because we know that there's a disconnect. And we hear from liaisons all the time who say, we don't know. And we can remember from our poll at the beginning of our time together today that not everybody knows what their set aside is. And so as the best first step, make sure you're connecting with your business office or your Title I director. And the other piece of that question had to do with EHCY subgrants, so a different funding source from our Title I Part A funds. And so those are also funds that come from the federal government to states, and then states are required to grant those out in a competitive grant process. So those are typically on a grant cycle. And so if you are not receiving those funds, again, I would encourage you to think about connecting with your state coordinator, reaching out to ask where you are, where your state is in that grant cycle. It's different across all states, so I can't tell you where everyone is, but make sure that you're connecting with your state coordinator who can tell you when that application process will open up. That is another excellent way to think about how you can use funds, and again, blending and braiding those funds and using funds to support students. So I will drop in the chat the link to the directory of state coordinators. If you're not sure who your state coordinator is or you don't know how to contact that person, I'll drop the link in the chat so you have access to that as well. All right. Anna Sophia, what am I missing here?
I can't help it. There's one question that, well, we have our Vermont folks still here, would love to ask, which is there was a question there about you all have established a minimum set aside amount, and kind of if you could share a little bit more about how that happened from your knowledge.
It predates both of us, honestly. So I am sorry that I cannot share exactly how that happened. Jesse, unless you have Insider knowledge that I don't know.
No insider knowledge. I just was going to say, like we've talked about, is that the correct amount? Year after year, we
Yeah.
do kind of reflect on it and say, should we have a minimum? Is five, like we said, 500 is our current. And we do reflect on that and say, like, should we change it? Should we increase it? Should we keep it at 500? So yes, the original decision of 500 happened before we were here. But we do reflect on it, I think. And because there's just such a vast like differentiation between our school districts in the state, we have not changed it yet, right? Because some are, doing the minimum and some are doing far, far more than that. So we've sort of kept it the way it is. But yeah, the original decision did happen before that. And I think someone asked, is that like required to go through like legislation or anything like that? I can say for us, it definitely doesn't have to go through legislation. It's just a state administrative like procedure decision. Obviously, maybe different states have different requirements, but it wasn't for Vermont.
Okay. I had a feeling it was something that predated, but I wanted to just shed light to that because I know that there are some folks who wish their state had it, and maybe you all can be advocates with your state coordinators and other folks to try and see if that can move. So I wanted to just spend some time there. Karen, am I good to just close us out?
There were a couple more questions around allowable uses that I just want to give a kind of very broad statement about. We had some questions come in about apparel, so things like shoes and coats, jackets for students, and whether funds are able to be used for that. And I would say yes, absolutely. We know that students need those things to participate. If students don't have shoes to participate in gym class, and that's a barrier, then we can absolutely use funds for that. Along with that, there were some questions about graduation materials and whether or not the funds can be used for caps and gowns and things like that. And again, yes, we want to remove barriers for our students so that they can participate in their education. Always checking in with your business office, your federal programs directors, but we want to make sure that our students have access to all of the educational opportunities that their peers do. So I would say that those are generally allowable, but again, make sure that you're checking in, getting yourself to the table with those federal programs directors and your business offices. I spoke with a liaison a few weeks ago who said when the person in charge of the money and the person in charge of implementing the program are not talking, of course there will be a disconnect in how we're serving and supporting our students. And that was probably the best piece of advice that I've heard on this topic in a long time. So step one is to build those relationships and get to the table. So I think we've gotten the bulk of our questions. I know there are a lot of very specific questions that are still coming in. And I want to just remind everyone that we have this toolkit that is available that has a lot of information on allowable uses. We've got our Q&A that's posted on our website that also includes some Title I questions and answers. And then I think, Anna Sophia, I don't want to steal your thunder, but we are also going to preview that we have some webinars coming up with local liaisons who are going to share some great strategies as well. So thank you so much for all of the great questions. And Anna Sophia, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Karen. And that was a perfect segue because there's always more questions. And I know that it is great to hear from a state perspective because you all will be working with your state to make sure that some of this gets implemented, but definitely hearing from your peers is helpful as well. So please come back in 2026. We're going to be announcing a new series where, again, we'll be kind of going into the nitty-gritty details with LEAs who are doing some of this work. So please, if you're not signed up to our newsletter, encourage you to do that so you can stay informed. This is our information. We are on all the socials on LinkedIn, on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Blue Sky, and X. And so please feel free to do that. Please continue the conversation. As Erin shared a little bit earlier, we have our Schoolhouse Connection community on Slack, and this is a place to connect with your peers around what they're doing if you're not in a space with them already. So it's a good place to be. And then the last piece is just, this is Karen and I's information. We will send out these slides. And again, you will get those certifications in 48 hours. But just know that we're available to you if you have any questions. And of course, we have our Q&A and our contact form. So please reach out to us if you have any questions. And thank you all for your time.
And thank you so much to Katie and Jesse. We appreciate you so much. So thanks for joining us today.